When the Crusader fortresses and Saladin's legions both hit the physical extremes of the Middle Ages, warfare fell into a complete kinetic deadlock. Yet the terminal variables that truly dictated the course of history presented a counterintuitive mass cliff. A forged parchment weighing a mere 20 grams that disarmed a massive fortress from within, and a warm flatbread placed with precision on the Supreme Commander's bed, bypassing the line of sight of heavily armored guards. When the gravitational potential energy of trebuchets lost its efficacy, what dismantled absolute defense systems was no longer a physical weapon of greater destructive power, but asymmetric intelligence penetration and the terminal intervention of microscopic mass. This was a dimensional clash between physical denial systems and intelligence networks on the Middle Eastern battlefield. At the southern end of the Jabal al-Khalil Mountains, resting on a basalt bedrock at an absolute elevation of 650 meters, the site selection for Krak de Chevaliers was not driven by the symbolic need for territorial claiming, but rather by brutally cold geopolitical suppression calculations. At this physical coordinate, the fortress formed the single absolute commanding height overlooking the Homs Gap. The Homs Gap is the only natural, gentle corridor between Antioch and the Mount Lebanon range along the Mediterranean coast, allowing for the all-weather maneuvering of large-scale military formations and logistics trains into the Syrian interior. The physical occupation of this high ground equated to the complete geographic severing of the north-south and east-west military mobilization networks in the Middle Eastern theater. Any army attempting to pass through this corridor would be constantly exposed to the direct surveillance and flanking strike range of the fortress garrison. Observing from the topographic profile, the basalt high ground where the fortress is located exhibits extreme natural inclines on its south, east, and west faces. This harsh terrain inherently constituted the first line of physical denial defense. The heavy destructive weapons of the 12th and 13th centuries, counterweight trebuchets, relied heavily on flat, stable emplacement bases to support the gravitational potential energy conversion of counterweight boxes weighing several tons. The massive physical gradients surrounding the high ground directly eliminated the possibility of besieging forces establishing heavy firepower positions within the effective projectile radius of 150 to 200 meters from the fortress perimeter. Siege engines were forced to retreat to low-elevation valleys with extreme angles of elevation. The laws of physics dictated that the initial velocity and kinetic energy of heavy projectiles launched at this elevation angle would be exponentially reduced by Earth's gravity. Their destructive force upon impacting the target walls was forcefully minimized, rendering them incapable of causing structural penetration. After overcoming the topographic disadvantages and approaching the structure, what the besieging force had to face was a concentric defensive configuration that pushed kinetic energy dissipation to its extreme limit. The inner ward was not built on soil, but anchored directly into the extremely high-hardness basalt layer. At the base of the structure, a massive limestone sloping glacis with a maximum thickness of 24 meters was constructed. The precisely calculated angle of this design forcefully altered the impact surface of any incoming projectile, generating a ricochet effect upon contact and converting frontal vertical destructive force into a tangential slide along the slope. Simultaneously, the dense rock foundation of over 20 meters fundamentally eliminated the tactical option for enemy sappers to conduct underground tunneling operations to undermine the wall's base. Rising beyond the sloping glacis was the inner main curtain wall, averaging over 3 meters in thickness, with core load-bearing nodes reaching up to 8 meters thick. The vertical height of the wall approached 30 meters. Its interior utilized a composite pour of high-density rubble and high-strength mortar to absorb the shock waves generated by heavy impacts. The outer layer was seamlessly clad in precisely cut, massive square stone blocks. The maximum projectile payload of trebuchets at the time was around 300 kilograms. When kinetic energy of this magnitude struck this armor, it could only cause localized spalling on the stone surface. The fortress's defensive line was divided into a dual inner and outer system. The outer perimeter wall was relatively low and thin, with a longer defensive circumference. Its engineering design logic permitted the outer wall to be locally breached under concentrated strikes. Here, the outer wall acted as a massive physical trap to draw in targets. Between the inner and outer walls lay a wide, open-air circular space. Once enemy infantry forcefully scaled or breached the outer wall, they would fall directly into this death zone, devoid of any cover. At this point, the 7 massive semicircular towers projecting outward from the inner wall, each roughly 10 meters in diameter, eliminated the blind spots associated with straight walls. Operating in tandem with the firing positions atop the 30-meter-high curtain wall, they utilized the massive height differential to execute 360-degree crossfire and vertical plunging fire on the enemy troops trapped in the circular trench. Besieging forces in this area would face a unilateral slaughter with an extremely high attrition ratio. Furthermore, the design of the main eastern entrance demonstrated an extreme logic of geometric spatial defense. The fortress completely abandoned the traditional straight-through gate, adopting instead a vaulted ramp corridor buried deep within the towering structure. Within this passage, several elbow-shaped hairpin turns approaching 90 degrees were implemented continuously. For a heavy battering ram to breach the inner gate at the end, it would require a straight runway of significant distance to accumulate kinetic energy. This zigzag corridor completely zeroed out the runway distance in physical space, rendering battering rams entirely ineffective. Similarly, enemy warhorses were unable to maintain acceleration or formation charges within this narrow, steep, and winding passage. Along the arched ceiling of the corridor, vertical firing positions known as murder holes were densely arranged. The garrison inside could pour high-density boulders or high-temperature liquids down upon the trapped enemy forces at any time, executing vertical physical strikes within a confined space. However, the extreme defensive metrics of Krak des Chevaliers were not only reflected in its armor and firepower configurations, but also in its built-in extreme life support system. This system was designed to maintain the physical holding of the fortress under the extreme condition where all external supply inputs were completely severed. Hidden deep underground in the core area of the inner ward was a massive semi-subterranean vaulted gallery measuring 120 meters in length. Based on the conversion of its internal spatial volume and the density of medieval military supplies, at full capacity, the total calories provided by the dry grain, olive oil, wine, and large quantities of salted meat stored in this area were sufficient to sustain the minimum consumption survival of its fully staffed complement of 2,000 armed personnel for up to 5 years. Water is the absolute core variable determining the time cycle of any siege. Krak des Chevaliers achieved a fully closed-loop water cycle through engineering. All flat roofs across the massive architectural complex were precisely planned as giant natural water collection funnels. The abundant rainfall brought by the Mediterranean climate during winter was fully captured and accurately channeled through an independent aqueduct network embedded within the walls into 9 massive deep stone cisterns located underground. The deep subterranean environment prevented water evaporation and spoilage. This meant that the conventional siege tactic of cutting off external surface water sources was completely ineffective against this fortress. Regarding the kinetic processing of daily supplies, The interior of the fortress integrated wind-powered mills and gravity/animal-powered mills that required no external energy input, complete with large stone ovens built for large-scale communal catering. Even in the transition zone between the outer and inner walls, spacious stone-vaulted stables were constructed. Their environmental metrics and ventilation design were sufficient to meet the long-term enclosure and daily combat readiness requirements of hundreds of heavy warhorses. Krak des Chevaliers was a completely self-sustaining closed ecosystem and firepower hub. It physically blocked all conventional means of destruction in conventional warfare. As long as the internal personnel and supply configurations met the baseline design, within a 5-year cycle, hard siege tactics relying on conventional weapon kinetic output and severed supply lines could not shake its operational logic. This structure, stacked through mass, gravity, and geometry, constituted the absolute fact that human defensive engineering of that era could not be breached by frontal assault. In the Middle Eastern theater of the late 12th century, when the Crusaders and the Ayyubid dynasty fell into a structural deadlock during the physical collision of heavy armor and siege engines, mere troop stacking and defense attrition could no longer break the strategic balance. The denial capacity of physical walls had its performance ceiling fixed within the two-dimensional space of the surface. At this juncture, the command center of Saladin, founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, bypassed geographical obstacles and constructed an asymmetric intelligence communication system characterized by high-frequency transmission. Relying on this mechanism, the blocking efficacy of massive stone barriers was subjected to a complete dimensional penetration. The core operational hub of this communication system was not anchored to a static rear-echelon fortress, but functioned as a highly modular information distribution node conducting tactical maneuvers alongside Saladin's main camp. As verified by the objective records of Imad al-Din, a scribe accompanying the army during the siege of Acre from 1189 to 1191, Saladin utilized reeds and timber to construct dedicated military biological carrier transmission and reception stations, giant pigeon lofts, adjacent to the command tent, located extremely close to the front lines. This was not a one-way information broadcast point, but a mature, two-way dispatch and reception hub. In the initial stages of the campaign, the Ayyubid intelligence network had preemptively completed the physical rotation mechanism for its biological carriers. The frontline garrison and the external command camp pre-exchanged flocks of homing pigeons they had respectively bred. Building upon this foundational layer, a wide-area transmission route, with Saladin's mobile camp as the absolute origin, connecting point-to-point directly to the empire's 3 core operational nodes, Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, was fully activated. This dispatch mechanism established absolute tactical speed suppression on the battlefield. Based on physical calculations, the homing pigeon, acting as a biological carrier, could achieve straight-line flight speeds of 48 to 96 kilometers per hour in the air. As an objective comparison, under the harsh terrain and climatic conditions of the 12th century Middle East, the maximum daily march distance for heavy infantry formations and logistics wagon trains was restricted to merely 20 to 30 kilometers. This massive speed differential, magnified geometrically, meant that Saladin's orders for grain requisition from the Egyptian agricultural zones or assembly commands issued to reserve legions in the Syrian defense sectors could be transmitted with penetrative force at speeds over 100 times faster than physical ground units. This top-down command delivery completely ignored, in physical space, any armed blockade zones and high-intensity patrol networks established by the Crusaders on the ground defense lines, achieving strategic-level operational synchronization across geographical scales of thousands of kilometers. However, any physical information transmission system operating outside absolute defensive armor faced the objective risk of being physically intercepted mid-transit. The anti-air crossbow arrays equipped within the Crusader camps, along with specially tamed interceptor birds of prey, constituted the most direct, hard-kill threat to this aerial communication network. To ensure the security and ultimate delivery rate of military intelligence data when subjected to physical interception, Saladin's Privy Council implemented rigorous ciphertext conversion mechanisms and mandatory physical redundancy operational protocols at the information output source. At the source stage of information output, all highly classified core combat reports involving troop deployment coordinates, structural weaknesses in city defenses, and the extreme consumption rates of supplies, before being sealed into miniature waterproof leather tubes attached to the legs or tail feathers of the pigeons, had to undergo ciphertext conversion by senior scribes. Through preset mechanical character replacement rules, the surface logic of the information was completely scrambled and reconstructed. This encryption method ensured that even if a biological carrier was shot down by enemy anti-air fire and fell into hostile territory, the scholars and military clerics within the Crusader ranks could not extract any underlying tactical commands from the intercepted parchment fragments. This mechanism fundamentally eliminated the possibility of intelligence being reverse-engineered and deciphered within the enemy camp. In the specific physical dispatch phase, to hedge against the probabilities of natural weather-related attrition and hostile artificial interception of the carriers mid-flight, the command system established a forced redundancy delivery standard known as one message, triple dispatch. A single ciphertext-converted combat report never relied on a single biological carrier for transmission. Instead, it was exactly duplicated by scribes into 3 or more identical texts. These duplicate texts were entrusted to multiple pigeons of the same batch and heading, released in parallel into the aerial trajectory at the exact same tactical timestamp. This redundant dispatch protocol, executed without regard for biological attrition, utilized absolute coverage of multiple probabilities to forcefully compress the risk of communication chain breakage, caused by the death or deviation of a single carrier, to the absolute minimum. This ensured that amidst dense anti-air fire networks and harsh high-altitude weather, at least one set of information would successfully penetrate the physical blockade and reach the receiving end. During the 2-year-long siege of the Acre fortress, this biological carrier-based communication system evolved into the most extreme 3-dimensional coordinated operational model, encompassing land, air, and water within the military systems of the time. Faced with the strict naval blockade imposed by the Crusaders' massive fleet on the port of Acre, conventional coastal supply vessels and surface transport lines were completely severed. To sustain the continued holdout of the city's garrison under extreme conditions, Saladin deployed units of armed divers with exceptionally high tactical value and mortality rates. Taking the historically documented diver Isa as a typical example, this branch executed extremely demanding deep-water infiltration missions at night. The divers tightly bound waterproof leather bladders containing high-value supplies and tactical sealed orders to their torsos. They precisely calculated and utilized the environmental time windows at night when sea surface visibility dropped to extremely low levels, diving into the visual blind spots of the Crusader heavy galleys patrol networks. Pushing to the limits of deep diving by abandoning all surface breathing actions, they forcefully bypassed the ship's physical blockade line from underwater, sneaking into the heavily besieged defensive zone of Acre. However, this model of underwater individual infiltration faced extremely high midpoint interception rates and physical attrition rates. The external command hub had to obtain definitive feedback on the execution results of the mission to determine subsequent resource allocation and tactical reconfiguration. Therefore, both attacking and defending sides established a zero-latency closed-loop confirmation mechanism at the system's baseline. At the exact moment a diver successfully breached the naval blockade, landed, made physical contact with the garrison inside the city, and fully completed the handover of supplies and sealed orders, the garrison would immediately extract a homing pigeon with a pre-assigned heading from the enclosed lofts hidden deep within the fortress, releasing it into the night sky, bypassing ground defenses entirely. This homing pigeon, acting as the operational confirmation signal, would fly over the Crusaders' layered blockade camps and land directly at the reed pigeon loft next to Saladin's mobile tent. This coordinated model of underwater physical infiltration coupled with aerial biological return transmission constituted an extremely rigorous operational feedback loop that could not be severed. It enabled the Supreme Commander, situated in the external main camp, in the dead of night, where visual observation was impossible and surface physical communication was completely cut off, to precisely monitor the survival rate of high-value diver units and the actual completion rate of supply infiltration missions by relying on the returned biological carriers. The massive siege works and dense blockade fleets of the Crusaders were reduced to static defensive ornaments in the face of this microscopic, high-speed, and three-dimensional asymmetric intelligence penetration mechanism. Beyond physical walls and defensive lines, intelligence acquisition relied on the deep nesting of legal identities. The state of war in the 12th century Middle East did not entirely sever bilateral commercial operational systems. Crusader states and the Ayyubid dynasty maintained concessionary tariff and safe conduct pass agreements based on mutual interests. Ayyubid intelligence nodes precisely nested themselves within the bulk trade supply chains of spices and silk. Islamic merchants holding legal physical transit credentials not only utilized high-volume and dense capital flows to cover the physical transfer of micro-intelligence payloads, but also used this to legally reside in core Crusader military and port hubs like Acre and Tripoli. Beyond merchants, the intelligence network extensively recruited wandering ascetic monks. Relying on an outward appearance of extreme material deprivation and chaotic movement trajectories, this demographic was automatically downgraded to non-threat entities within the Crusaders' conventional military screening logic, thereby perfectly evading the visual tracking and interception of checkpoint networks along their routes. The reconnaissance logic of this espionage system completely discarded visual estimations of troop strength indicators, such as the number of banners or tents. The naked eyes of frontline scouts were highly susceptible to deception by fake march routes and decoy camps, but the physical consumption required to sustain the biological engine of a tens of thousands strong legion was absolutely impossible to forge. The focus of intelligence gathering was pushed directly down to the lowest level material fluctuation metrics. The primary monitoring target was the physical gauge of calorie reserves. Once the selling price of wheat and barley in the core markets of enemy-held territory exhibited violent upward spikes during non-famine seasons, it directly indicated that the Crusaders were executing extraordinary, concentrated military supply requisitions. This was the most precise precursor to the massing of large-scale legions or the establishment of long-term siege reserves. Next was the destination of kinetic energy conversion carriers and logistical traction power. The abnormal disappearance of specific dimension timber, such as Lebanon cedar and high-strength oak, from the civilian market directly equated to the enemy constructing heavy siege engines, exposing their tactical intent for an upcoming hard siege. Simultaneously, intelligence personnel precisely recorded the forced requisition volumes of draft oxen and mules, as well as the scale of hay bulk buying in the markets. Based on the fixed payload limits and daily calorie consumption constants of draft animals, The intelligence system was able to build mathematical models directly locking onto the maximum physical radius that Crusader logistics wagon trains could penetrate into the arid interior after departing their supply bases. Furthermore, fluctuations in industrial consumables and battlefield life support supplies were equally integrated into the monitoring matrix. An abnormal surge in charcoal consumption in areas with blacksmith shops leaked the fact that the Crusaders were pushing iron forging capacity to the absolute limit to stockpile single-use kinetic munitions, such as metal warheads for heavy crossbow bolts. Meanwhile, the large-scale centralized procurement of medical consumables used for wound astringency and physical cleaning, such as alum, high-concentration vinegar, and clean linen, directly exposed that the enemy commander had mathematically pre-programmed a campaign with an extremely high casualty rate, revealing the command center's bottom line regarding battle damage tolerance. The aforementioned low-level material data, scattered across various commercial nodes in enemy-held territories and seemingly unrelated, ultimately completed physical convergence as ciphertext directed to the rear hub, the Secretariats in Damascus. At the Damascus Information Aggregation Point, specialized audit officials did not focus on the localized dynamics of a single battlefield. Instead, they processed macro-level material ledgers. They cross-spliced coastal intelligence, net throughput values of European wide-body transport ship dockings and armed personnel after stripping away routine merchant vessels, with the grain price curves, timber inventories, mule and horse livestock counts, and medical consumable ledgers of the inland markets. Through this objective mathematical projection based on foundational economic indicators, Damascus completely stripped away frontline tactical camouflage. Before the Crusader armies physically mobilized, the Ayyubid command hub had already precisely reverse-engineered the enemy's absolute warload limits, the critical breaking point of their logistical pipelines, and the genuine troop deployment cycles. The fog of war at the physical layer was completely penetrated by the reverse calculation of economic data. In August 1176, the heavy armored legions of the Ayyubid army launched a full-scale siege on the stronghold of Masyaf. Saladin's personal command tent was anchored at the absolute geometric center of the army. Its perimeter defense system was not a simple stacking of troops, but was constructed upon an extremely high-density network of physical denial and visual overlap. The innermost ring of the camp was composed of multiple circular defensive lines formed by Saladin's most trusted Ghulam guards and Mamluk heavy infantry. Nighttime patrol shifts were drastically intensified, and the patrol routes underwent precise geometric planning to ensure that any angle of entry and physical space around the command tent were constantly within the overlapping visual coverage zones of two or more groups of heavy guards. To counter the tactical ability of assassin infiltrators to bypass visual sentries, the guards implemented basic forensic-level countermeasures on the ground surrounding the core command tent. They evenly spread a ring of chalk powder and wood ash, forming a completely closed, low-intensity physical pressure recording belt. Any unauthorized physical mass crossing this area would leave irreversible footprint impressions on the surface. This constituted a purely physical detection line stripped of visual dependency. However, this defense system suffered a dimensional penetration. The assassin not only perfectly evaded the intersecting lines of sight of all heavy guards, but also completed physical entry into the highest security command tent, reaching the Supreme Commander's sleeping quarters without triggering, or by flawlessly restoring post-entry, the wood-ash pressure recording belt. The three objects left on the bed presented the Ayyubid command hub with an ultimate deterrence that transcended conventional physical destruction. The first object was a flatbread bearing the specific mark of the assassins. Its core tactical value was not the object itself, but its accompanying thermal radiation. This flatbread, which still retained residual heat, constituted an extremely precise and unforgeable physical timescale. It objectively proved a fact to the target. The actions of infiltration and extraction occurred within an extremely narrow time slice. Minutes, or even seconds before the target awoke, the assassin was still within absolute operational range to execute a physical decapitation. The second and third objects were a short blade coated in lethal poison and a parchment letter pinned directly to the bed by the blade. The physical placement of the poisoned blade represented a deliberately aborted output of lethal kinetic energy. Meanwhile, the letter bearing the seal of Rashid ad-Din Sinan input a clear logical directive into Saladin's neural center. If the armed siege of Masyaf was not immediately lifted, the next perimeter penetration would no longer terminate as a warning, but would directly execute the physical erasure of the commander. Facing the absolute failure of the command hub's defense line, Saladin's response logic was not to expand the scale of physical assault based on instinct, but to pivot toward brutally cold tactical projections and resource consumption audits. To guard against this asymmetric strike that ignored conventional troop formations, a commander had to forcefully elevate personal life support security levels to the physical limit. Objective tactical records indicate that following this incident, Saladin was forced to alter his baseline survival state, wearing heavy chainmail at all times while sleeping. Maintaining the highest tier of anti-assassination defensive posture meant forcefully depriving the commander of deep sleep and physiological recovery cycles. Furthermore, because the outer physical pressure recording belt had not been triggered, the commander was forced to expand the scope of precaution and suspicion to the innermost circle of guards, deducing a mathematical probability that internal nodes within the system were either complicit or compromised. This defensive posture was a bottomless sink of hard attrition. In an extremely short cycle, it would lead to a cliff-edge degradation of the Supreme Commander's biological functions and trigger the collapse of the trust system at the base of the Army's chain of command. Based on an absolutely rational logic of stop-loss, Saladin confirmed that continuing to maintain the conventional physical siege of Masyaf had entirely lost its tactical return. As long as the assassin leader could not be physically eliminated within an extremely short time window, the life continuity of the Supreme Commander of the Ayyubid army would remain perpetually exposed to unblockable asymmetric strikes. Every delay in military operations equated to an infinite expansion of sunk costs. Saladin immediately ordered the entire army to strike camp and retreat, forcefully cutting off physical resource inputs in that theater. Alongside the withdrawal, he dispatched envoys to reach a non-aggression truce agreement with Rashid ad-Din Sinan. The core objective of this strategic pivot lay in the complete stripping of potential systemic risks from the macro war situation. Within the war situation model of the 12th century Middle East, the Crusader faction possessed ample motivation and precious metal reserves to hire the assassins to execute tactical assassinations against Islamic commanders. Through a diplomatic agreement with zero physical cost, Saladin successfully stripped this asymmetric strike force, which held an extremely high tactical yield, entirely from the Crusaders' available arsenal. He utilized negotiation and contractual mechanisms to clear out the single largest uncontrollable variable in the future projection of the Ayyubid army's campaigns, trading an extremely low compromise cost for the absolute security of the entire command hub, thereby completing one of the most precise strategic stop-losses in warfare. In the summer of 1188, the Ayyubid army advanced to the perimeter of Krak des Chevaliers. Saladin's command hub did not issue conventional orders for formation deployment. Instead, a team of accompanying military engineers executed rigorous on-site parameter calculations. The core targets of the calculations included 3 sets of physical variables: the angle of the 24-meter-high sloping glacis on the south side of the fortress, the solid thickness of the basalt main curtain wall, and the maximum projectile payload of their own counterweight trebuchets. The comparative results revealed that kinetic projectiles could not produce structural penetration on the main wall. Simultaneously, the Damascus Secretariat completed projections on the logistical consumption model. The closed-source water system and the fully loaded subterranean storage rooms within Krak des Chevaliers constituted a life-support closed loop capable of sustaining a multi-year holdout. Conversely, for the tens of thousands of troops in the exposed terrain of the Homs Gap, maintaining a siege of equal duration would see grain consumption and non-combat attrition due to disease form an exponentially growing sunk cost. Based on the dual objective data points that kinetic energy could not pierce the armor and logistics could not cover the siege cycle, Saladin's tactical model yielded the mathematical conclusion that the cost of a forced assault was unacceptable. A rational command system does not issue hard military orders against targets that defy the laws of physics and mathematical logic. Saladin directly ordered the entire army to strike camp and retreat. This was the absolute denial of military strike operations by a purely physical defense system. 83 years later, the deadlock of physical denial was broken by a means from another dimension. In March 1271, the Mamluk Sultan Baibars I arrived with his army. After 36 days of high-intensity suppressive fire and subterranean mining operations, Mamluk sappers stripped away the relatively vulnerable outer defenses on the southern side of the fortress. The Crusaders retreated to the inner ward, and the battle immediately devolved into a deadlock at the concentric defensive lines. The 30-meter vertical height of the inner wall and its sloping base stripped battering rams and heavy trebuchets of any point of purchase. Over the subsequent 10 days, the battle came to an absolute standstill. Relying on infantry charges and conventional engines, it was no longer possible to cross the final physical barrier within a controllable casualty ratio. Physical assault efficacy had hit its ceiling. Facing the indestructible Basalt core, Baibars I terminated pure kinetic energy attrition, pivoting the axis of attack directly toward the enemy's information reception hub. The Mamluk accompanying Secretariat initiated a terminal forgery sequence targeting the Crusaders' highest chain of command. The physical payload of this forged letter was merely a single-page parchment, yet it encapsulated 3 precise layers of camouflage. First, source camouflage. The letter indicated it was dispatched from Tripoli, with the sender being Hugues de Revel, the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller. Second, grammatical and logical closed loops. The text employed Latin grammar and proprietary military terminology, compliant with 13th-century European monastic orders, constructing the logical premise that Tripoli is powerless to muster reinforcements, and holding an isolated fortress has lost its strategic meaning. Third, hardware-level authentication. The bottom of the letter bore a perfectly replicated official wax seal of the Knights Hospitaller. In a historical cross-section, lacking multi-factor verification methods, this seal constituted the highest physical credential for the legality of a command. The ultimate vector of the letter was a maximum clearance tactical directive, authorizing the garrison of Krak des Chevaliers to immediately cease resistance and accept the evacuation corridor provided by the Mamluks. This letter, loaded with lethal logic, was delivered into the inner ward. The garrison was isolated within a closed, defensive ecosystem, their external communication network comprehensively severed, losing the physical conditions necessary for secondary information verification. After confirming the characteristics of the wax seal and the standard Latin text, the commander's cognitive system accepted the forged directive. On April 8, 1271, the ironclad inner gates, capable of withstanding continuous impacts from heavy battering rams, were manually opened from the inside by the garrison. This extreme defense system, with design specifications capable of sustaining a closed operation for 2,000 men for 5 years, was not shattered by any trebuchet. Instead, due to the input of a forged abdication command, it autonomously terminated its physical defense protocols. In the Middle Eastern theater of the 12th and 13th centuries, there existed two insurmountable, absolute high walls. One was the intersecting visual defense line, constructed by heavy guards on the perimeter of Saladin's camp, representing the extreme limit of biological alert density. Yet it was pierced from within by a flatbread emitting minute thermal radiation and a short blade. The other was the towering basalt curtain wall of Krak de Chevaliers, representing the physical extremes of engineering against gravity and kinetic energy, which was ultimately and completely dismantled by a 20-gram parchment stamped with a forged seal. When the intensity of conventional warfare hits the hardware ceilings of kinetic output and physical armor, the terminal variables that dictate the course of history and the survival of a campaign undergo a dimensional leap. Beyond systems of pure physical denial, a microscopic incision in an information transmission system, a precise shock to a psychological load-bearing pillar, or a single line of forged low-level instructions ultimately takes over the veto power of the battlefield.